And so I have to wonder if the seeds of the discontent of American political culture right now were sown at the universities 40 years ago. You may have heard last week that a new university announced itself, the University of Austin. And there's since been a lot of interesting things that have happened. There's been vitriol, there's been questions, there's been mocking, there's been all sorts of different things that have come out. And I applaud the idea because we do think we need new institutions, as I said, but I also think we need the culture to change dramatically in academia to go more toward the pursuit of the truth and less away and much away from the some of the nonsense that plagues universities currently, both in bureaucratic and social justice and financial constraints and all these other different things. And so I hope they get there, and I would like to see more of how they're going to do that. But this came up. I think it was actually Robert George, who was the Princeton professor who hosted Dorian Abbott, put this one on Twitter and caught my attention as I was skimming through it, and I thought it would be interesting to discuss. So, opinion. Does America actually need a new conservative university? This is in Politico, and it is written by Michael Roth, who is the president of Wesleyan University, and I believe I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm not 100% sure. And he's actually very different on the spectrum. He's as Robert George said online, he's to the opposite side of the aisle from me, which is fine. I totally appreciate that. I love hearing from folks like this, so this is good. Let's go. I haven't read it all the way through, so I may be reacting a bit live. No idea. It's good to start a new school, whether your goal is teaching children to read or helping advanced students realize their greatest potential. So why all the controversy about the founding of the University of Austin? And this is very true. There was a heck of a lot of stuff that went on after that announcement was made. When UATX announced its arrival this week being last week, it was greeted with acclaim by some, especially donors it seems, and mockery by others. Former New York Times columnist and now Substack star Barry Weiss led off by turning her newsletter over to the founding president of UATX, Pano Kanellos. Although recently the proud president of a school devoted to the Western canon's great books, Kanellos lamented the sorry state of American higher education. As the head of this new institution, he promises a commitment to 3 principles: the unfettered pursuit of the truth, freedom of inquiry, freedom of conscience, and civil discourse, and being fiercely independent. Is that 4? No. Oh, no. Okay, I see they grouped them all together. Got it. The school is in Texas, after all. Students aren't mentioned in the articulation of these principles, which is probably why teaching isn't referred to either. Of course, if you're going to start a new school in a nation which already has many, it is appropriate to say why. You don't want folks wondering whether the resources involved might be better spent elsewhere. Right now, many schools are being closed for financial reasons, from neighborhood schools without enough youngsters to fill classes to colleges too small to be sustainable. Pundits predicted that the pandemic would result in hundreds of colleges having to close, and although that hasn't come to pass, there are scores that are struggling or looking to be bought up by larger institutions. And this is also a very true statement, actually, because I know for a lot of universities that switched partway through their spring semester to go spring semester 2020, they switched partway through from in-person classes doing everything online, and that resulted in a flood of complaints in different universities from all the students who were forced to go home. I think in a lot of cases international students were allowed to stay, but the students who were forced to go home, but they still paid for the housing and dining and all of that for the year. So of course that made significant students and parents who were paying the bills very unhappy. So at least I know in cases of a few universities, they had to refund an awful lot of money with respect to some of the things that, of course, students were not able to take advantage of now. Logically, that made sense to do it, but it did put a heck of a financial burden on a bunch of universities and colleges. So what need is it filling exactly? In a year or so, UATX will offer its first credential, and despite all the rhetoric about the novelty of its principles, it's one that a new educational venture targets: a business certificate in entrepreneurship and leadership. For those who can't wait until the summer of 2023 for this essential service, there are at least 100 other programs in this area offered by universities from coast to coast. Again, true. New schools can still have great value even if they're plowing existing ground. One of the great things about the system of American higher education is that it is not a system at all. Students who want to specialize in engineering may choose a large university or the more Experimental Olin College of Engineering, a young Massachusetts school that has smartly rethought what young people really need out of a college. Someone who wants an intensive studio experience of designing new spaces and objects might choose a multidisciplinary art school like the California College of Arts in San Francisco, or prefer a small liberal arts school with a strong studio program. This diversity can be confusing, but it can also be immensely enriching to the landscape of American education and to students who are exploring what they might love to do, get better at it, and learn how to find work in relation to their skills after graduation. UATX can add to this diversity. And yeah, that's also very true. Between everything from community colleges to large four-year university programs to specialty degree programs, there is quite a breadth already, which is, again, what are you doing different, you Austin? And I would actually contend the system of American higher education. I agree in part, and I don't agree in part, which is going to sound strange, with the idea that there's not a system at all. No, actually, in that, I agree that there's a diversity of it and that it's not a system. I also disagree, and I do say it is a system because it has been so drummed into the consciousness with high schoolers going into college that that's what you do after high school is you go to college and you get a university degree and you go off and do something else, when that's not necessarily the best avenue for that student, for an individual student, or something a student really wants to do. In the case of my own mother, for example, she's told us, my sister and I, countless times, I didn't really want to go to school, but that was what was drilled into me that my mother wanted me to do, was to go to college. So I did, but I didn't really want it. She's told us that many times before, as my sister and I. So there is a sort of system in the sense that it's kind of socially built in that this is what you do after high school. You go to college, which is not necessarily a good thing. I would actually love to see it where students out of high school don't go into college until they get into their mid-20s, because it's around the mid-20s when the rational part of your brain is fully formed. That would be the better time to get started in college, to be honest. So there's that. I also disagree with it not being a system because, and maybe he gets into this later, there's some attitudes, behaviors which seem to have grown common to colleges and universities, which are not necessarily conducive to bringing in students who are uncomfortable with those attitudes and that error and how a university or a college may function. So that's the other kind of thing. So there's common functionality there between universities, I think. The University of Austin makes space for itself in this ecosystem, however, not with a bold new idea, but by attacking the other species already out there. Its own justification for launching is that other institutions suffer from not being adequately devoted to truth, from a lack of civility, from a failure to protect free speech, and from being tied to the elite liberal consensus that has been branded lately as wokeness. We've heard such complaints time again from moderate and conservative critics at odds with students and faculty devoted to such things as rooting out racism, treating less conventional people with respect, and eradicating gender-based violence and discrimination. Most of the critics are themselves in favor of these things in principle, but they fear that through a combination of self-righteousness, hypocrisy, and groupthink, campus cultures have gone too far. For at least the last 50 years, this has been the complaint from young people in the institutions that serve them, about young people in the institutions that serve them. They go too far and thus create new problems through their single-minded devotion to principles. The founding salvos of UATX, so its single-minded devotion to three principles, may be good marketing for donors, but as a serious critique of American higher education, they miss the mark. It's true that elite colleges have an issue with groupthink, but the American higher education system is already immense, and once you look past those elite colleges, you'll see a huge range of philosophies and politics. I do agree, to a sense, actually, that there is a huge range of philosophy and politics, but I also still maintain the contention that there's sort of a system ethos, in a way, or at least a perception of that ethos where you're not welcome if you come from a certain background, where you're not welcome if you don't hold to certain things, and it may be a little bit different at different institutions. I grant you that, but that's the critique I have of that. I also think his critique of UATX is fair, actually, because it is one thing to just attack something else. And I think the attack is to a degree justified, that there's become more concern over social justice and less concern over the pursuit of the truth, and allowing the pursuit of the truth to happen in viewpoint diversity. I think there is a lot fair critique of that to happen with different universities. And I speak to this myself as someone who does work at a university. I'm a young scientist in the university. And so I think that's fair critique to make. But I think Roth here is also fair to point out that just attacking isn't good enough. Just building something based on attacking somebody else is not good enough. And so that's where my question, my demand to know from the University of Austin still comes in, is exactly how are you going to change the culture of academia? Because I think it is the culture of academia that drives toward groupthink, particularly in the larger institutions, drives toward groupthink, that needs to change. That needs to change dramatically if you're going to have improvement. Because I think it was Jonathan Rauch who pointed this out in the Gallup survey, that it was 2018. It was the first time in history that less than 50% of the American public has confidence in higher education. Less than 50% of the American public trusts institutions of higher education. Which, again, trust them to do what? What do you mean by trust? Trust them to do what? There's another thing. That question on surveys also annoys me. It's just like, you trust scientists. With what? That's an unhelpful question for me, as I'm trying to analyze data and figure out, okay, how do we address the trust problem? Well, trust them to do what? What do people trust me to do? What people not trust me to do? Different things. Random tangent there, but anyway. So I think that's fair. I think it's a fair critique, and it's one that I would share, and it's a question that I still have for the University of Texas, Austin. How are you going to change the groupthink that tends to pervade academic institutions currently? How are you going to change it? And it's not going to be done overnight, because it's been a mess like that probably for a long time. At least it's gotten worse, because I did my undergrad starting in 2004. And it was palpably getting bad by the time I finished my PhD in 2016, and I feel like it's only gotten worse since then, which for me is sometimes very difficult to admit, because it's hard to find, it's hard to have some conversations that we would want to have when you're not sure if somebody's going to call you say that you're offensive or something like that just for speaking your mind on something. Anyway. Over the last few years, I have worked with about 400 partner institutions, including the Association of American Colleges and Universities and the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, for the purpose of helping students prepare to participate in the public sphere. Some of these partners are community colleges where the students often have full-time jobs and families whose education can include learning a trade. Others are schools with religious faith at their core, and the education they offer is in the service of religious as well as secular goals. Some bring rich and poor people together in ways that rarely happen elsewhere in American society. I agree that don't get me wrong, I agree that there's a range, but there's also a pervasiveness to some of the groupthink that's happened that's been associated with what is colloquially referred to as wokeness. There's a bit of a pervasiveness to it, because I have seen very Christian universities starting to incorporate wokeness, which I would argue is not in line with Christian faith. So that is one particular thing I would point out. There's a certain pervasiveness to some of the things here that, yes, there's different philosophies here, but some things and that's not like the freedom of speech thing there and the freedom to believe whatever you want. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But when everything starts to look and behave the same way, despite what is said as their core or core belief or how they focus or the core philosophy in an institution, but it's just changed around that, if you will, then it's a question mark. At the University of South Carolina, philosopher Jennifer Frey advocates powerfully for a virtue ethics grounded in the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas. In the spirit of open dialogue, she recently hosted her podcast noted progressive Cornel West, and not because they agree on politics. Large Purdue University, under the leadership of former Republican Governor Mitch Daniels, is promoting civic engagement among all undergraduates, as is small Davidson College in North Carolina, under the leadership of Carol Quillen, who studied and argued with the conservative cultural critic Alan Bloom. Wesleyan University, where I've been president since 2007, is a small liberal arts school with a reputation for progressive politics and intellectual diversity, has been a topic of campus discussion for several years. Glad to hear it. Good job. More than 5 years ago, we began reaching out to recruit military veterans on the faculty and in the student body. In the courses I teach, undergraduates engage with classics by thinkers like Aristotle and Rousseau, as well as the icons of contemporary progressive thought like Maggie Nelson and Saidiya Hartman. Nice! I like it. Because I would crave getting at some radically divergent opinions. Anyway, sorry. UATX and its supporters are not wrong about some of the ills that currently plague American academia. There is indeed a political prejudice in many departments, and hiring committees do tend to reproduce the biases of their members. As I've pointed this out to my colleagues, they often fall back on the same meritocratic platitudes of those who want to protect the status quo. Quote, we only want to hire the best. However, in bringing their biases to light, we expand their notions of what the best might be, as we point out that in the humanities and interpretive social sciences we offer only a narrow range of political perspectives, the seeds of change are planted. At Wesleyan, we are seeing this bear fruit, not through inviting right-wing provocateurs to campus to prove our free speech bona fides, but by calling attention to conventional academic prejudices and by hiring and inviting to campus serious scholars of conservative, libertarian, and faith-based traditions. That I applaud, and so long as you also, I don't know much about Wesleyan and if it's had any problems with people protesting campuses or what have you. I might check and see if they're in the FIRE free speech rankings, because I think they are. I'm not sure though. Because that's great. I'm glad to hear that, because that's more, it is one thing. I think it is a bit of virtue signaling to just invite a conservative provocateur like a Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, or something like that to campus. I don't think that necessarily helps improve and change the culture, because that just riles people up to a degree. You do need people who think very differently, who may say some things that are not what certain groups of people would want to hear or what people would find offensive. You do need that. But you need to have it come in there and have, what I want to see is maybe I'm thinking out loud, but I want to see it happen. And maybe University of Austin can do this. What I want to see is something like I saw at Bucknell University, actually. Bucknell has their Open Discourse Coalition, which I really like, because they just host conversations with two very different people having conversation on, and they might get really at odds with each other about something. And I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful thing when they started doing it virtually last year. They do it in person on Bucknell campus now, and I think they're having virtual sessions too, but doing that and doing that regularly with your faculty and staff who vehemently disagree with each other on an issue, demonstrating that they can discuss that, have a disagreement on that, and then still go have a beer later, maybe have a beer with a bunch of the students later, that demonstrates something that needs to be taught and reinforced, that you can have a very visceral disagreement about something, because you have a different value on this, a different value on that, and you can still go have a beer and be friends with somebody later. We need to reintroduce that, because what I'm afraid is getting lost is the humanity of the people we disagree with. There's a tendency, and it's particularly obvious in different political things right now, there's a tendency to say that because you disagree with me, you're inhuman. And that is extremely bad, to just ignore the humanity of somebody because you disagree with them, or just denigrate somebody because you disagree with them. We see this right now, and that's why I'm extremely concerned with the mandates surrounding vaccines. Get a vaccine. Talk to CDC, all that good jazz. I don't like vaccine mandates. I think that's very, very, very much bad news here. And I'm very concerned about things like what just recently happened in Austria, where in Austria, they recently went into a lockdown for the unvaccinated only. And one of the only reasons you could leave your house if you're unvaccinated was to go get vaccinated. Things like that, when you start dehumanizing people to that point where you're doing that, is what concerns me. I'm not saying we're going to get there, but it starts with conversation and how you think about people who disagree with you, who make a different choice from you, who live a different life from you. If you allow people to think of them as less than human, then you end up going toward the much more extreme things eventually, if that's allowed to persist. And so I really want to see it with universities, because universities do drive so much of culture. I really want to see them get back to doing that, where you just have faculty, have them be out there publicly, having a chat over a beer or something like that. Do a beer Friday with a bunch of the students where the two professors just start chatting and the students can ask questions. Things something like that. Or even just, on a debate stage in a theater, any number of different things, where you can just see it. See that people can disagree and still treat each other as human beings. That's what I want to see come back with the university. That's what I'm getting lost in. That's what students tend to go wild with, is that some of the Heterodox Academy study, the fire survey, and what have you, pointed out how it's increasing percentage of students think it's okay to shout down somebody who disagrees with them on a controversial topic. We need to show that that's not right to do, and we need to show that, yeah, you can have very, very different opinions on a controversial topic and still treat each other like human beings. Need to demonstrate that, not just talk about it, demonstrate it. And I like this in what Wesleyan is doing, because that goes in that direction. So good on you, President Roth. I appreciate it. This is analogous to how we've made change in regard to race and gender bias. By raising awareness of the problem, we have made progress in countering it. Administrators and faculty need to work harder at intellectual diversity in humanities and social sciences, and we need to maintain a commitment to free expression, even as we remain wary of those who would use the commitment as cover for the exercise of power and intimidation. Furthermore, universities must remain places where enduring questions from a variety of traditions are explored. In my experience, the power of this exploration does not lie in showing us that now we know the truth. It lies in creating opportunities to discover the things we believe might be wrong. As a teacher, it's a great joy to see a student's prejudices dissolve through conversation, inquiry, and the study of powerful works, and it's an even greater thrill when this happens to oneself while teaching. I realize that the University of Austin is trying to raise money from donors whose wallets will open more quickly when they hear complaints about woke warriors or pronoun police. But you shouldn't misleadingly disparage higher education in general in order to make a place for yourself, especially when declaring one's devotion to truth. These complaints about other schools are really reflections of American political culture. So many seem to think that those with whom they disagree have just gone too far, be that in regard to environmental regulation, public health, or changing language to become more inclusive. Those accused of exceeding some border of civility or failing to protect free speech often return the favor and caricature their accusers as enemies of justice. The rounds of mutual recrimination only further erode the basic trust that a healthy political culture requires, that a healthy campus culture requires. It's good to start a new school. The ecology of higher education can have a niche for the University of Austin. If it turns out to thrive, it doesn't have to be at the expense of the work being done at other colleges and universities across the country. Okay. I appreciate the opinion, Professor Roth. As I said, though, universities are an important aspect of culture and where they drive culture. And it's where the next generation of political leaders, of scientists, engineers, doctors, go on down the list, are trained. And so what's going on in a university and what that sort of general culture is, and the amount of groupthink that there is, does matter with respect to American political culture, and it does matter with respect to what that looks like now versus what it will look like later. And so I have to wonder if the seeds of the discontent of American political culture right now were sown at the universities 40 years ago, 30 years ago, in the generation. So like 30 years ago. So these would be folks who are in their 50s now. What were they learning 30 years ago that it becomes so discontent now? And what are they teaching now in K through 12? Because our teachers get education degrees, right? And then they go on and teach in K through 12. So the university and what's going on there does concern me, and that's why I want to see new institutions, because I am concerned about the groupthink. I am concerned about the overall atmosphere of the universities as a whole, whether you think it's a university system or not, that they're getting in that direction of being more focused on social ills and less, not social ills, on social justice, and a narrative of social justice, regardless of whether or not that narrative is exactly true. And so there's a thing there. So I don't necessarily think he's entirely right. I don't think he's necessarily entirely wrong. Let's put it that way. I got a very different opinion from him, and this is a very raw kind of reaction. So I may tack more onto the Thursday thoughts and locals, because I may have thought more about this then, because I was just reacting to this just now as I was reading it. Anyway, and it's been my it's been my experience that it seems to have gotten worse in the last 10 years, not better. Anyway, that's it for now. If you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video. I'd love to know your thoughts. Share the video. Subscribe to the channel. All that good jazz. Until next time. Oh, don't forget, check out Locals. Come over to Locals. Come and join us on Locals if you'd like to have some fun chats where the trolls can't find us. Anyway, that's it for now. Until next time, I'm Adrian. I hope you stay curious.